How do I even begin this kind of video? Resident Evil Village is not a good Resident Evil game. Whoops, I spoiled the video. Now to leave a condescending comment and act like this guy is the second coming of the T-Virus. T-Virus! In all seriousness, I think this is going to be a bit of a trend on my channel going forward, where I talk about my initial thoughts about a game in a short video and then proceed to give my thoughts on the game after I've gotten to chew on it a bit more. I did it with Temtem and now I'm doing it with Resident Evil Village. And let me get this out of the way. If the title and opening didn't give it away, this video is going to be a bit more negative than my previous video on the subject. But that said, I like to think that if you think that this is probably the best Resident Evil to date, or if you just simply like it, that's perfectly fine with me. I respect your opinion, but apparently that sentiment isn't universal. And while I don't think Resident Evil Village is a great Resident Evil game, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's a bad game in general. So let's begin. And note, this will have spoilers for the game and will expect some level of knowledge of the Resident Evil series.
Long ago, a young girl went with her mother to pick berries for her father, who was hard at work.
Let's get this segment out of the way, since this is something that I need to address. No, the story isn't important in Resident Evil games. Resident Evil is known to be goofy horror-themed schlock, and I acknowledge that. I am not looking for the second age of Shakespeare in this game, and that's totally fine. Not every game needs to provide a gripping narrative to be excellent. Breath of the Wild is probably one of my favorite examples of that concept because despite giving a bare-bones story, the rest of the game with its mechanics, art style, and other factors managed to overshine that weakness, especially considering that the story took a back seat for the most of the time for the player's interaction with the world in that game. However, having said that, when a story is presented to someone, that means they're allowed to critique it, especially when it's talking about the main motivations for the character we're playing, Ethan Winters. Even if you want to think that the story isn't important, the fact that it's still there and the fact you still need to interact with some degree, especially in the beginning with the walking sections that you cannot skip, I feel you still need to consider the story to some degree when it comes to critique.
Oh, hands off, mister.
Let me preface by saying that the story isn't a deal breaker for me in this game, but it's still worthy of criticism since this is a game that did cost me $60. Now, if you've watched my previous video on the subject, I expressed that I found it weird that Chris Redfield didn't inform Ethan of the plan, and that there wasn't any reason for Chris to not tell Ethan. To address a common rebuttal to my issue to this, I was brought up with the suggestion that there was a concern with Ethan being infected with a Godot. Fair enough, I suppose. Sometimes I feel like I'm infected with some horrible disease that makes me go insane after watching my supposed wife die. That's just a regular Tuesday for me.
Well, not really.
Sarcasm aside, it's a compelling argument, but considering a later scene in the game,
"You killed my wife, you son of a bitch! You think I killed Mia? That wasn't her. It was Miranda."
What?
it literally would have taken 3 seconds for Chris to say that. Even if you want to bring up the possibility that Ethan could have been infected, what would be in the harm in telling him? Especially when the rest of the group knocked Ethan out and dragged him away. But I know the reason for why Resident Evil Village does this. It's an attempt to get the people's shock value for the game's story, and that's another reason why I feel it's necessary to critique the story, even a game like this, because there is some attempt to do so. Besides, with the amount of effort put into it, it should be criticized in that regard. I still enjoy the storybook setting, but in hindsight, it's really weird for Mother Miranda to be reading a book that is so on the nose with not only her plans, but also her minions. Like, it's really meta for me to go about this, but the game's being really meta here too. Meta writing can just be as good in that regard and make go, oh! Meta writing done well is... And in hindsight, I can appreciate it as a small meta nod to the fanbase, regardless of how Heisenberg could have known about this incident that took place in the volcano. Stuff like that with the meta writing is perfectly fine. Now that I've verbally beaten the word meta into the ground like a fine paste, I think there's another aspect that I should talk about with the story, and that's basically the pacing of it. While I appreciate the skip cutscene button, there are still sections of which you will still have to waddle through, and it honestly makes me roll my eyes and I just want to get on with the damn game, especially on repeat playthroughs. And for a game that's expecting me to replay it over and over again, I'm gonna outright say it. It sucks. Part of me wants to make a Pokemon Sun and Moon reference where you have to be stopped so much, but that'd be a blatantly unfair comparison to Resident Evil 8. But as per my agreement with the obnoxious Pokemon fanbase, I have to make one reference to Pokemon in these reviews just to make them mad.
If it takes damage in this state, it'll retaliate by spitting out its catch at the attack.
Oh, damn. Ow!
While it's certainly not as egregious as the handheld games, they certainly do make me want to get up and get a soda, but you can't even do that. You have to be an active participant. You want to get a snack? Take a whiz? Maybe wonder to yourself in the mirror how you got 3 degrees and this is what you're doing with your life. Too bad, you gotta put your baby to bed. And this leads into my next issue with the game, linearity. Now, before someone gets on my case, no, I am not saying that linear games are a bad thing. There are a ton of games that I enjoy that are linear. Hell, games in the Resident Evil series itself, and 2's remake is probably as linear as you can get. Resident Evil 4 is just as linear. FYI, I will be bringing up Resident Evil 4 a lot in this video because it's clear that there's a lot of inspiration for this game, for Village, which I'll probably be going more into when we get to the gameplay section. Back to this, I find that RE Village's biggest issue when it comes to story is linearity. Take for example when you're in the village and dealing with a huge pack of werewolves. You know the scene, the one where you're at the village where no matter where you're at, you're thrown into the river on the brink of death until for some reason the werewolves are called away. It's an obvious callback to Resident Evil 4's village battle scene, only done more cinematically, and for the most of the time you'll be railroaded into a certain path. Now, here's where I blow your minds. The game does this well for the scene. Most of the time, the players will follow a path so they can get their hands on the shotgun, then go down the ladder, go through the crawl space, and attempt to find cover. And yes, I'm aware there are people who will hide in the crawl space, but most of the time the players will still follow the path to the shotgun and go down there. The reason why this works so well is because you're being challenged with a ton of enemies, and almost countless kind. And it's the same trick that Resident Evil 4 used in its gameplay where it hid its linearity by having the player go through frantic combat decisions in order to force the player to think on their feet. But unfortunately, that, my friends, doesn't last for long, since most of the time the enemies you'll be facing come at you alone or in small numbers. So much so that you can get a good chunk of them with a clean shot at the shotgun.
This is my boomstick!
This kind of stuff with the village actually happens few and far between, at least that's the feel I got after playing the game a few times. I'll go into this more when we get to the gameplay, but there's one more aspect that I want to touch on about linearity, and that's the puzzles.
Hey, Monkey! Do you know Superstition by Stevie Wonder?
Well, I say puzzles, but they tend to run so counter to what Resident Evil's puzzles have been, and it gets to the point where I have to talk about it here because, hey, plot progression. It's tied to it. The one I've got on screen is a good example of here. You're railroaded into this room right here where you're forced to solve the puzzle. You can't access any other rooms, and in order to continue, you need to solve this. Now, I know that sounds standard fare, but for Resident Evil, like if we go to like Resident Evil 2, there will be things such as like the saves, which you can't unlock until you actually find the combinations. I mean, you'd come back. So you have to take note of it. You could find the puzzle, or whatever item you needed, and come back to it and probably access it later. Notice that because I'm going to be talking about that in a few seconds. Frankly, it allowed the player to actually come across the puzzle and solve it at their own rate. If they had the right item, then hey, they can continue onwards. Or if they knew ahead of time, like the combination to a save or anything, they could open it up and get a bonus early on. Or if they couldn't have the items or didn't know what to do, they could always come back to it and explore other aspects. You can even see this in the original Resident Evil games too. One of the major aspects of Resident Evil, even in some of the newer ones, that you had to find puzzles that you're not required to solve right off the bat. And most of the time, you don't have what you need to solve it. And at times, you'll have to go around and find the stuff you need, and you wouldn't be on a track towards it. A bad example can be found in the castle of Resident Evil Village. Take, for example, the last mask you need to leave the castle. For those who don't know, when you are trying to get out of the castle, you need to find 4 masks. And there's a linear path you need to take in order to get to them. Hardly any exploration, hardly any chance to move on your own pace.
What the fudge fickle?
Yeah, I got issues with it. For the 4th mask, they do something a little different. They lock the door behind you when you take the mask, meaning you'd have to find something to replace the mask you took in order to get out. That sounds like a good puzzle, right?
No.
Well, in normal Resident Evil games, you'd have found the piece earlier or at least saw what you need, but you wouldn't know what it'd be for. And sometimes you'd have to go back to get the item you need, passing through dangerous areas. Or you would discover the room that you need this puzzle piece, and learn you can't get out until you have the proper item to replace it with, so you'd have to come back later. But in Village, in the room there's a small hatch that you can climb through, you fight a boss, and then you get the item you need.
Are you kidding?
See, that's what I'm talking about with railroading. There's a singular path. If anything, I compare this to Final Fantasy 13 of all things.
Fuck you, you crazy bitch!
There's one puzzle I think I need to bring up, and it's the piano puzzle. If you know how to read sheet music, and you can play the piano, congrats, you solved this puzzle. Probably one of the worst puzzles I've ever seen in a game, though. Because if you don't know how to read sheet music, don't worry! You can just slam on all the keys until you find the right note, and it'll stick. There's no way to fail against this puzzle. Like, if you hit the wrong note, you don't need to restart taking the notes.
Oh, this never goes well.
This is something that ties in the game's road. Yes, you can break off from the path, but you'll never find anything that actually helps you progress or allow you to play the game in a different way. which is a great way for me to go into my next segment.
We thank you for winning. And now let the games begin! Let's see what you have. Ethan Winters.
I've already expressed that the puzzles of the game aren't great. Hell, there's not even a penalty for the puzzles most of the time if you get them wrong. But what I will say is that the game does a good job with what it's given. Gunplay. And my oh my, the gunplay is sick. It certainly is satisfying getting off headshots, and when the game wants to give you more claustrophobic and multiple enemy encounters, it can be very exhilarating. Most notably is the factory and the path to Heisenberg's factory are especially to note since they actually do carry Resident Evil 4's vibe to distract you from the linearity that the game has you on. Hell, I'd argue that the factory is my favorite part in the game and holds a lot of elements found in previous Resident Evil areas that have a lot more backtracing puzzle solving and dynamic combat encounters. Like take for example the enemies coming at you while you have to shoot at hazards' weak points. Focus too much on the hazards and you can get surrounded by the enemies. For this kind of game, it's best to have these sort of encounters front and center. When the game wants you to do that, it's amazing. And that's something because this level is just as linear as the others but has more player choice with it. And that's the rut. Player choice. Now, I'm not saying multiple pathways or such or alternate endings, although Resident Evil certainly isn't a stranger to it. Just look towards the remake for the first game as an example for that.
There's only one left. There can't just be one left. What the hell are we gonna do now?
Fuck this noise, man!
What I'm referring to is basically putting the player through situations and have them decide what to do. To explain, let's talk about the inventory system. I brought this up in my original video on the subject, and after playing the game more, I still agree with my stance on it. Basically, I find the inventory system to be a major issue for the game. And for this, I'm going to have to refer to both Resident Evil 7 and 4's inventory system management to explain my points.
Well, good luck with that.
In 7, you had a much smaller inventory than you do for Village, which meant you had to decide what you wanted to carry on your person as well as what you would leave behind in the chest. That also included key items, your gunpowder, chem fluid, herbs, psychostimulants. You get the idea. You literally had to make a choice on what you wanted to carry with you.
Conserve it! Save it! Save the goop!
Speaking of those 3 items, they also offer the player a choice what they could do with them, since you needed chem fluid in order to create either healing goop or bullets. Meanwhile in 4, you'd have a much bigger inventory system, obviously, but not only would you have to have a lot of items come your way, but you'd still have a lot of big stuff to decide what to put in your inventory and manage it. Guess what's not possible in Village? Because of the ability to collect scrap metal, you have the ability to craft bullets. So gone is the stress of wondering if you should make more firepower or make more healing goop. What's worse is the scrap, gunpowder, chem fluid, and herbs are set alone with themselves, so they don't take up actual space in your inventory, and also includes your treasure items and key items as well. Although not the meat that you can collect.
Meat is the foundation of any decent society.
This to me effectively eliminates a major component of Resident Evil's gameplay for a while now, and as such has eliminated any actual part of the survival horror of this game. You see, the thing about survival horror is that while the games may not be scary per se, at least on a subjective level, you still had to deal with the horror-based elements and the tension that came from the situations you were put in. Do you want to use your ammo to clear out a room, or do you want to risk going by the zombies and leave them for another time? It's an element that's still in the remake of Resident Evil 2, a game I still consider to be one of the better Resident Evil games as of late. But with Village, not the case, especially when you have a ton of supplies to help you out. Any of you do run out of space, you're easily able to get an upgraded case from the Duke, so you'll get more room. And here's the thing. When the game gives you stuff for killing everything, it's not survival horror since it gives you more and more materials to work with, especially money. There are a few other hiccups in the game, like in the opening section of the game when you're fighting the werewolves, you'll be faced with a familiar mechanic from Resident Evil 4. I already talked about this, but here's something that I find interesting, because in the village you'd have to find ways to brace yourself from the buildings against the villagers. And it's something that I should point out because it's a commonality between the two games, basically bracing yourself inside a building to hide yourself from the oncoming attacking villagers. And it was in a couple sections for Resident Evil 4. Meanwhile, for the life of me, I can't remember any other time to do this in Village. I know I brought this up in the story section, but there are also times you would be forced into walking sections that barely have any gameplay to them. Like, the best example would have to be the whole running simulator after you have the big bosses meeting and basically running forward and pushing an action button just to go ahead. This isn't really a problem, but something I should point out as it can be a bit annoying since there aren't any real problems with them except they just waste time. It's just something made me raise an eyebrow. But what I do find to be an odd choice is going back to the village encounter with the mass horde, where you're given the implication that this is going to be the rest of the game. It's first impressions that don't live up to expectations, at least not until the very end of the game. So yeah, a lot of the game is not like that opening section. You know, I'm sitting here editing this portion of the video, and it just came to me why I feel like the combat in RE8 doesn't have the same oomph as it does in 4. And you're gonna sit here and you're gonna listen to why I think that, and that's because there's a lot more you can do with Resident Evil 4.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script.
Take, for example, the enemies. One of the aspects I think really stands out is that the enemies in RE4 will react depending on where you shoot them. And when you do that, you'd be allowed to do a few things, like you can get them to flinch, or if you were to take a risk, you'd be able to rush up and perform a kick depending on where you shot them. And that'd be a great thing to do, since if you could get a ton of other enemies nearby and one you kicked, you'd knock them all over because you have a frame of invincibility. And then, if you were feeling gutsy, you could knife them all to death. There were other things that you could do that would add to the dynamics of the combat. Stuff like shooting the weapons out of the air that your enemies threw at you, shooting the dynamite in the enemy's hands, pushing them off ladders, shooting them into their own traps. What helped was the whole variety of enemies and mini-bosses in the game. Like, even though there was a lot of linearity, Resident Evil 4 does a good job of hiding it by allowing the player to do a lot of different things in order to tackle the enemies. Let's just take Leon's pistol. Like I already stated, facing one enemy, he's given 5 different spots to shoot them, and then it will affect them in 5 different ways. Headshots will inflict more damage on top of opening the opportunity for a QTE. The body will do some damage, the arms open up another QTE opportunity, and the legs will drop the enemy. Even in combat, it offers a lot more in my opinion than Resident Evil 8 does, and I think that's mainly due to the fact that it's first person, which, while I can appreciate from a horror standpoint, this game isn't really going for a horror vibe.
Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
Speaking of baddies, I think it's important to talk about the bosses of the game, and I gotta say, it's a real mixed bag. Like, pretty much the only bosses I liked were the final boss,
Fuck you, you crazy bitch!
Urias, and Sturm, because those were at least interesting fights that required more challenge than what was given to the other bosses. Like, Lady Dimitrescu's daughters are probably the most pathetic bosses I've seen in games, especially the second one where there's a ton of room to maneuver in the boss arena.
You're pitiful.
Lady Dimitrescu, okay, like, I get the idea what they were going with in the design way, but the whole thing falls flat when you realize you can just walk backwards while shooting her dragon. Angie is not a boss fight.
Stupid idiot!
She's just a game of hide and seek that you've got to find her 3 times and stab her in the head. Moreau isn't too bad. I mean, I don't really care for his design, but hey, that's kind of the point. But he's also a bit too spongy for my liking. Oh, and Heisenberg? Look, I like the character. He's a fun character. I do like his attitude, and he does spit the actual Resident Evil vibe going on here. But his boss fight is a bit too hold button to shoot. It just comes off a bit too blustery for me. I mean, I'm not asking for the greatest bosses of all time, but when you have things like the original Resident Evil 3, where you had puzzle-based fights, basically leading Nemesis over to the valves and having him get, like, toxic waste in his face. Something like that would have been a welcome change in this whole thing, you know? And I suppose we should talk about the greatest horror aspect of the gaming century. Basically, the baby sex. I got some people complaining about me talking smack about it, and that's a shout out to PT, and it's a great aspect of the game. What
the fuck do you think, asshole?
Okay, look, if you like the baby section, more power to ya. I can see why people like it. But let me point out a few things so you can at least see where I'm coming from. The first is the whole scenario, wherein all your guns are taken away from you. It already sets up that there's going to be a lack of enemies here, since throughout the game there hasn't been a section that challenges the players when they're unarmed. I'll still stand by my criticism of the baby segment too, since I still personally despise the run and hide trademarks of horror games in the past. And even if you had your guns, you literally could just make the baby invincible or stun it when you shot it a few times. And in all honesty, it kinda gets even worse on subsequent playthroughs. Rarely will I think something is scary when it happens to me a second time, and it loses that fear factor more and more as I continue to play and play, especially if what you do each time is the same thing. As it stands, you just run away, hide under the bed, wait till it passes, and run to the elevator to push the button and get in. Poof! You're done. You know how else this could have been solved? Taking a page out of Alien Isolation. In that game, you had a lot of options when you were dealing with a xenomorph. If you had the right weapons, you could drive it off, you could hide, or you could throw something to distract the creature. After all, you do throw bombs in this game too, so you could have used a recycled throwing animation for that. Still, I will admit, the baby is an effective and creepy monster. I will definitely give it that. It certainly checks the boxes, but honestly I find it amazing that just because I had issues with the section that apparently I don't know anything about the Resident Evil series. The internet is such a great place. One of the reasons that the game is the way it is, it comes down to the fact that the developers got feedback on how Resident Evil 7 was too scary. The company's primary goal is to always create something that anyone can feel comfortable jumping in and playing, which not for naught I can respect from a developer standpoint, but as a gamer I feel as though they dipped a bit too much into the action orientation, and that's what it does for me. Then again, this is Capcom we're talking about, and after Dead Rising 4...
A lot of user research. We send a ton of research out, and we do a lot of Q&A with people, and we found out that people, it was okay, some people really liked it, but more people didn't like it because they wanted to be able to go, you know what? You ended my game and I was so close and I don't want to have to go do that all again.
Right. I honestly don't believe that sort of line nowadays is...
What else matters?
We matter, Ethan! You matter! You just
Mia, what are you talking about?
I feel like I'm jumping all over the place with this video since this should be in the story segment, but it needs to be said, and frankly...
The water needs turning on and those toilets need flushing.
Mother Miranda is an extremely lackluster villain. She happens to be this almighty scientist who lost her kid years ago and basically found a way to be immortal through the Mega Mycete. I apologize if I mispronounced that, but I'm not going back to say it. However, due to the fact that we don't get a lot of scenes with her, characters like Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg take the spotlight, and when you kill those two, well, you're just left with this dull character. I also really don't care for how all of Umbrella is dependent on this new character that showed up. Like, I kinda hate this sort of thing in writing, where a sequel will present the man behind the curtain.
And what of the Emperor's condition?
From what I understand, everything has proceeded as the Emperor has foreseen, and he remains in a secure location.
Getting off my high horse, I still stand my points on Rose, and because I'm lazy, here's the clip of me talking about that. You know, while I can appreciate the fact that Ethan's going after his daughter, this is something that I pointed out in an older video of mine not too long ago. If you want to create some grade A investment, add a little kid to the mix. Although, really, it comes up as a cheap Hollywood attention-grabbing move now that I think about it. Rose isn't really a character, she's a plot device, and just because we spend the first few minutes of the game with her, that doesn't really make all that much of a connection or make me care for the kid. This isn't me complaining that she's a baby. I'm complaining that she's a plot device in order to get the story rolling, as well as acting as motivation for Ethan.
You ungrateful, selfish wretch!
Speaking of motivation for Ethan, some people seem to think that I like Mia because I said that at least in Resident Evil 7 there was some character establishment for her. Not only do I find her to be insufferable as a character in Resident Evil 7 because of her keeping secrets and kind of being vague as all hell in RE8, but she's just a puzzling character. By the logic of Resident Evil 8, and major spoilers by the way, Ethan died at the Baker house and the only reason why he's alive is because of the mole. So, shouldn't Mia be in the same boat? I seem to recall her dying.
Oh! I was gonna run for it. I was gonna fucking run for it!
So, shouldn't she be like Ethan? That she's only alive because of the mold? And why wouldn't she be more direct about this to him in the 3 years that they've been back together?
The fuck do you think, asshole?
This is just stupid. I'm moving on. I'm not trying to make this a big deal, but just clearing that up. Speaking of Ethan, I don't know what to say. The developers attempted to give him the Leon Candy treatment where he becomes more sassy and wisecracking, and sometimes it works.
Hey, don't I get a say in this?
But couple that with his constant daughter talk, it makes it hard for me to stomach listening to the guy. It's like they tried to make Ethan a sympathetic guy, yet cool at the same time. And it just doesn't work for me. And I know people are going to point out that he was a bit sarcastic in the previous title, but at least he wasn't as insufferable. I mean, you could probably replace him with a plank of wood, but hey, at least I didn't hate Ethan.
Oh, you have something to say?
Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg were really what stole the show for me when it came to the interesting characters, which, while I can appreciate, still have their own flaws. Lady Dimmy was pushed heavily in the marketing of the game, and yet she's taken out in the first part of it, which I can imagine disappointed a lot of people.
I'm not sure that was actually Lady Dimitrescu.
No, I don't want Lady Dimmy to have more screen time. I'm not that thirsty, guys. I was just expecting her to have a bit more late or even mid-game content, especially considering how much of a push she had in the marketing.
Well, Ethan Winters. There you are.
Too bad I can't see anything now.
At best, maybe have her appear a few times in the beginning, have her chase you, and you'd have to come back to face her in her castle. As for Heisenberg, he comes a bit too late. Yes, we do get a taste of his personality at the beginning of the game, but I think that there should have been a few more times where you heard him talking to the other bosses of the game. Show us more of how they interact with each other. Give us some characterization. Like, we know that Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg don't like each other. Maybe have a phone call between the two or something like that?
Devil may cry.
Shut your damn mouth! And don't be a sore loser! Go find your food somewhere else.
Quiet now, child. Adults are talking.
Look, I'm not going to complain too much about the design work, because the game looks amazing. It's smooth, and I already talked about how the enemy design is good to me, just a bit limited in that regard. And the second being that there were dips in frame rate at times, to the point where it actively messed with the gameplay. Now, I don't have my own gameplay to record, because sometimes you don't have that luxury when you're trying to enjoy a game, but luckily for me, I have this!
Ow. Oh, the graphics! What the hell? Why'd the graphics go poop? My frame rate! What'd you do to my frames? Ah, my frames! Her attack texture frames directly!
Well, it wasn't too much of an issue, and graphics aren't my bread and butter. If it gets to the point where it affects the actual gameplay, then that's an issue for me. If you're in a frantic session and the game decides to lag when you need to be able to make snap decisions, that's a bad thing to happen. I mean, luckily the only time that happened to me was when the daughters and their flies attacked, and I already explained how they're not that tough. They kind of suck at bosses.
This. How dare you?
You're pitiful.
But it's still an issue that should have been caught. The field of view is rather weird. I don't know how to really explain it, it just feels really narrow, and thankfully there's a mod for it, but it just makes things a bit too cluttered for my tastes, which is weird because even with my limited vision, I still see better than Ethan.
Fucking Joker.
At the end of the day, this is all subjective, and despite me complaining about all this in 2 videos, I do think Village is a decent game. Maybe even good. Just not a good Resident Evil game, since there's so much that runs counter to its predecessors, especially 7 and 4. Both of those titles were extremely linear, but in the case of 4, you still had a lot of frantic combat encounters that hid the linearity, and still offered the player a lot of restrictions and choices that would have them actually think on how to go about their encounters. But with Resident Evil Village, there's a lot of things that kinda irked me about the modern day Resident Evil games. And yet, if you guys like a decent action game with good graphics, a dumb story, and all that jazz, I say go for it. But for me, this is a sign that Resident Evil games will hold these same issues that I have with it, and I'm sure a lot of people do like this sort of thing, and that's fine. But I think these things do water down the proper Resident Evil experience, at least to me, because, hey, I know that there are people who play Resident Evil for a variety of different reasons. Some play it to feel like a badass, others play it for the story, which, funnily enough, yes, there are people who do like the story. There are those who like to be scared, and there are those who just really like good, swift gameplay like that. I'm not expecting the greatest story of all time when it comes to Resident Evil. I still maintain that while the games of Resident Evil don't have the deepest of stories, the silliness and such does not come from inconsistent writing or the characters acting dumb. It comes from the execution of it all.
Fuck you, you crazy bitch!
And the cheesy over-the-top scenarios and plot threads. That is the charm of Resident Evil's writing, at least to me. But hey, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just some guy on the internet who makes reviews about pieces of media on YouTube and has raised complaints about the Resident Evil 3 remake. I totally don't know what I'm talking about.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script.